Alright, so right now I'll be doing a video on Chapter 2 of the Agnostic Inquirer. So before they go off on the entire discussion that will be in Chapter 2, they first lay out the entire argument that will be argued for in the rest of the chapters. Premise 1. If it is not highly unlikely that a world creator exists, then investigation of the contents of revelatory claims might well show it is probable that a good God exists and has revealed. Premise 2. It is not highly unlikely that a world creator exists. Premise 3. So, investigations of the content of a revelatory claim might well show it is probable that a good God exists and has revealed. And so, conclusion. A negative conclusion concerning the existence of God is not justified unless the content of a reasonable number of leading revelatory claims has been seriously considered. So Chapter 2 will be focusing on Premise 1 and Premise 2. So, when it comes to Premise 1, what reason could there be to be doubting it? The first one would be the problem of evil, and that will be discussed in later chapters, and so it will not be discussed in this video. The second question that could be risen is, do we know what a good God would reveal? And if not, then how do we really know whether it would really raise the probability? And furthermore, if we can't really know what he would reveal, then how do we go about even looking for revelation in the first place? The next question would be about the revelations containing errors. If revelations contain so many errors, is it really plausible to say that revelations can increase the probability of a good God? And lastly, there's the issue of lack of well-evidenced miracles. And if there aren't that many miracles to have evidence for, then what does this say about revelations in general, raising their probability? So, when it comes to the first question, what a good God would reveal, it is true we do not know that much. However, consider that when it comes to thinking about the greatest poet of all time, or intelligent aliens, in the primary case, when we think about the greatest poet of all time, when we think about what sort of literary piece they would make, we would obviously expect certain things. Of course, we would not expect to know specifically, right? If we did know, then we would, know the poem already, and that would make us the greatest poets by already knowing, already creating it. But that is not the case. But what we do know is that it would contain masterful use of language. And in the case of aliens, we don't know exactly what sort of signal they would send. What we do know is that they would send some sort of intelligent signal, and we do know what that would comprise in. So in the case of God, what we do know is that God would most likely, given that he's a good God, give words that will heal our deepest wounds, information on how to atone for our sins, and the like, and basically provide deeply existentially satisfying words. And furthermore, this content would also exceed human capabilities, for if it did not, then we would have no reason to believe that this is from a divine source. One worry that someone might have is that when it comes to explaining revelation, we might be having some sort of ad hoc involved, right? Because if we think that the best way of explaining the revelation, or not explaining the revelation, my bad, but the best way of knowing what a good God would reveal, or what God would reveal, is by thinking about the different characteristics of God, right? Then it just seems like you're adding abilities to explain things, and that just seems ad hoc, because there doesn't seem like there's a reason for it. However, there does seem to be a good reason for it, based on the revelation. We make our characteristics based on the revelation, and they will go into this later, so, yeah. The second sort of issue is, the revelation seems so full of errors, right? And if that's the case, then is it really plausible to say that revelations increase the probability of a good God? Well, the first thing to note is that while there are apparent contradictions, they're really hard to establish, right? So it doesn't make it obviously false that revelation is true, because there are so many possibilities to consider, right? Just consider the Trinity, for example. there are lots and lots of different models. The same thing goes for any sort of apparent contradiction in religion. And while it does not defeat the case, it still threatens it though. And so, like, what could explain this? One thing that could explain this is by appeal to human errors, right? We do know that the divine source should not have errors, right? What we can say is that the medium through which the divine message was sent might be fallible, right? Human errors are possible. Think about the testimony involved in all these miracles. They might be differing somewhat based on human errors. However, this does not mean that you cannot tell the basic divine revelation, or the basic, or the what's divine about it, right? Think about a game of telephone where you have an adult send a very deep message to a bunch of kids. The kids will probably distort it somewhat in some way. However, the message will still be there, and you can still derive it that it's from the adult rather than the children. And another thing to consider is that there are many intellectuals who think that revelatory claims are worthy of belief. And if that's the case, then at least you ought to investigate the revelations, right? You can't just dismiss them out of hand. An interesting sort of thing to consider is that if we try to make sense of revelation using reason, right? What makes us so different from the philosophers such as Socrates or Kant, right? If we use reason to, come to our conclusions, then how does this differ from philosophy? What does revelation have to add? However, revelation does have something to add, right? As mentioned in the last video, there is something deeply satisfying about religion, right, that is not found in any philosophical system. And so, yeah. The last sort of issue regards evidence of miracles, and as it pertains to revelations. The first thing to note is that miracles, or as defined as violations of the laws of nature, are not really needed for revelations. For example, consider the Quran, right? Muslims believe that it is, the divine word. But they do not believe that it's a strict violation of the laws of nature. Rather, they believe is that it's beyond human capabilities to produce. And so that's why they consider it revelation or divine. It need not be a violation of the law of nature then, contra Swinburne. Another thing to consider is that Hume's argument against miracles doesn't seem to work on analysis. So, for example, consider the quote, "Through the being to whom the miracle is ascribed, be in this case Almighty, it is not, upon that account, become a whit more probable, since it is impossible for us to know the attributes or actions of such a being, otherwise than from the experience which we have of his productions, in the usual course of nature." So basically what Hume is saying here is that we know most about the Creator through the usual course of nature, not through these violations, right? So we can't really derive anything from them. We derive most of our things from the usual course of nature. Another point he makes is he compares the hypothetical situation of Elizabeth I's imagined resurrection with the Jesus's, and he considers them equivalent. And so, since Elizabeth I would be, what do you say? It would be explained by natural causes, then why not in the case of Jesus, right? However, consider that Elizabeth I's resurrection would not really explain anything, right? We wouldn't expect it. It would seem so out of the blue. On the other hand, Jesus has a lot of, reason for it. There's a lot of things to expect from it, and there's a lot of things answered by it. So the two cases are very, very different. Furthermore, when it comes to Hume's point on the usual course of nature, consider that the world came to be, right? If you don't really accept that, then maybe the world is contingent, right? It doesn't necessarily exist, or at least most things don't necessarily exist, right? So that's not really in the usual course of nature if we think that it has a cause. and I would explain that. So yeah, if it's not in the usual course of nature, then it seems like we need some not in the usual course of nature explanation. And so yeah, more interestingly, here comes premise 2. Premise 2, if you remember correctly, was it is not highly unlikely that a world creator exists. And what they mean by world creator is that it does, it's something external to the universe. It does not necessarily have to be intelligent, it just has to be a cause distinct from the universe. And so the defense of this comes in two premises, or two statements. First, the physical universe came to be, that is, it had a beginning, and two, whatever comes to be has a cause distinct from itself. In premise 1, they just defend by pointing out that physicists are, well, I mean, they're kind of divided on it, but at least like at least half, or around half, of the physicists involved, cosmologists involved, think that the universe came to be, had a beginning, right? And so this gives that sort of like 50% probability. Premise 2, whatever comes to be has a cause distinct from itself, has a very high probability. And the reason for this is that, I mean, rejecting this comes to, it's tantamount to rejecting the principle of sufficient reason, which leads itself to a lot of different issues. And there seems to be no good reason for thinking that this is false, right? Why think that the physical universe came to be, but it had no cause? You might object that, well, we don't know much about what's out there. Like, we only know the rules that are within the universe, not outside of the universe, right? As Quentin Smith explained, when it comes to the singularity, it might just be a lawless. He's talking about the Big Bang there. The problem is that that's not really, well, that's not widely accepted because, I mean, Hawking, for one, thought that the singularity was, well, not lawless. And, I mean, furthermore, there seems to be all sorts of complications involved in thinking that the singularity is lawless. For example, let's say that if the singularity is lawless, right, the action that it has that brings about a certain thing would also be lawless. And if that's the case, then there would not be really like a good reason to think that the physical universe came from this, because it seems like the physical universe would come about for no reason at all, actually. And that seems kind of weird, right? If you don't think the universe came to be from any reason at all, then you get all sorts of brute facts involved, and it's a whole mess. Another thing to consider is the more modern stuff, right? They don't really describe it in this book, but like, you know, stuff like the Proust-Coons epistemological skepticism sort of argument. You could also consider the Thomistic sort of argument. The Thomistic sort of argument. You could consider just the fact that you just don't see things come to be from nowhere, right? You never see that anywhere, and so there inductively just seems to me to like be very high probability that this is true. And if this is the case, right, if you have a 50% probability that this is true, and a very high probability, say 80% that this is true, you will get somewhere, I mean, you would obviously get to somewhere where a world creator is not highly unlikely, right? It won't be over 50%. It'll be kind of close, kind of not, but it'll still be somewhere, and then revelation could come in. Another thing to consider is the relation between an immaterial mind and matter. The book goes into depth about this, but the main thing they focus on is the conservation of matter, and also causation. So a lot of people seem to be puzzled by how an immaterial mind could interact with matter, right? It just seems weird, right? However, consider first that we have no real idea how matter or why matter interacts with matter, right? As a matter of fact, in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was considered much more plausible or much more understandable how an immaterial mind interacts with matter, but not how matter interacts with matter. And so this sort of question seems kind of, well, weird. Another thing to consider is that when it comes to the conservation of energy, there are a whole host of ways of dealing with it. You could come to reject it, though I do find that impossible. You could come to reject it, um, taking a line from taking inspiration from, say, Niall Bohr or Karl Popper or people like that. Um, but that does seem to be quite problematic because, well, physicists are very adamant about defending the law of conservation, probably because it's really, really fundamental. The other sort of approach you can take is that consciousness, right, or immaterial mind, um, its very actions constitute some sort of like energy loss or gain, and so when the overall action and the effect would result in zero energy loss, and they have a whole host of other solutions to go through. And I mean, yeah, that's it.